and I don't even have a hard copy, so I'm going to keep my remarks very brief. I'm very, this is a topic close to my heart, and part of the reason Winona has outlined the two case studies. The situation of Somali refugees in Kenya is one close to my heart because back in 1992 I volunteered with a Canadian group, and we actually built a feeding center for children in Dadaab. And that was 1992. I also worked that year for CARE in a Kenyan refugee camp, and then in '93 for UNHCR as a field officer, working on repatriation of Somali refugees to Somalia from the Kenyan camps, at which time there were about 400,000 refugees in Kenya. It was a very unsuccessful program, needless to say. But the fact that these camps, and there are some 120 to 150,000 people in them, the 3 Dadaab camps today, suggests 17 years later that the numbers James threw out and that others have mentioned are, you know, first of all, I'm feeling obviously quite old, but these are really pervasive issues, and people are spending a great deal of time in these camps. So there's a concern that your life is on hold, you're in limbo. I have very little time, so I'm going to keep it short, but methodologically we did these 2 case studies, but we also did a lot of interviews in Europe with institutional actors, UN organizations, state representatives, the European Commission, Amnesty International, ECRI, these are various acronyms, I won't get into them. But we wanted to study up, that is to look at those who are managing migration, asylum seekers, displacement, and so forth. So in a paper that came out in Government in Opposition last year, I made the argument with a colleague, and this was partly funded by our project, that non-refoulement, which is, you know, the guarantee that you won't be sent back into danger, has in some cases, through what's called the externalization of asylum in Europe. Externalization is a set of tactics to prevent people, asylum seekers, again, not all of them necessarily are refugees, but those seeking asylum, and again, you have to figure out who's who, but legitimate asylum seekers and perhaps others, also known as a mixed flow, terrible word, but that if you prevent people from getting to the very territory on which they could make a claim, you are, in a sense, enacting what we called neo-refoulement, which is to say you're preventing the person from making a claim and having their case heard. So the reason I bring that up is that I think that what's going on in the global north in terms of our policies, in terms of even our resettlement practices, but I think asylum determination particularly, it's a site that reproduces or at least makes it more difficult to solve the situation of protracted refugee situations. So that's one point. Winona and I have argued in a recent paper, and this is related to that first argument, that academic policy and discourse tends to produce refugees in protracted situations in particular ways. No, I'm not suggesting all research, but I think I'll say I'm guilty of it. There is a sense that people caught in protracted refugee situations are more genuine refugees. They're immobile, and because of that, they tend to be depoliticized. None of us have actually quoted a refugee today so far. I'm going to do that because in principle, I think that's very important. But I also think that there's as a geographer, which is my disciplinary training, there's a very interesting relationship between one's mobility and one's bona fide status or situation. And that is to say, if you stay still in a protracted situation, you are more easily managed, you are well behaved, you are not a threat to the global north. The moment you leave that camp and perhaps pay someone to get you to a place where you could seek a more permanent status, a more durable solution perhaps, I'm not recommending this, but the moment you approach that border in the global north, your political valence changes dramatically. So that's one of the things that Winona and I have written about in a recent paper, which is still in progress, really. Winona also mentioned the feminization of refugees, and by this I don't suggest that femininity is sort of male refugees are being feminized in terms of gender, but rather that there is a different valence. Refugees in camps and refugees approaching a border to seek asylum have very different meanings, and one is seen as a threat. The other is seen as the more depoliticized, perhaps the more bona fide. But again, I don't have time to give you enough evidence to show, but if anyone's interested, we'd be happy to share this paper with you. So let me just quickly move along. The quote that I have, or the header that I have here is, "Real refugees stay still." And I'd be interested, here in the front row we have representatives from CIDA, DFATE, and Citizenship and Immigration Canada. You know, Canada is generous in its resettlement policy of refugees compared to others, but I think that we have to look at who gets settled. We have two ways of coming to Canada as a refugee asylum seeker and a person from a camp. Is there a different valence for each of those groups? And again, I'm not going to try to answer that question. But I do think that people in protracted refugee situations have a plight that gets depoliticized, in part because we don't hear from them. So, on that note, first of all, Lisa Malki, a refugee scholar, who says, quote, "Refugees stop being specific persons and become pure victims in general. Humanitarian practices tend to silence refugees." Now, this is not hugely new, but I think it's extremely important. All of us are using the word PRS. That's lexicon from UNHCR. It helps us to create some common grids of intelligibility. But ultimately, we have to be very careful that we don't voice over the contextual differences that Winona pointed out, or the voices of refugees themselves. So that's one point. And here we have a quote from Halima Ali from our Somali research. She decided to leave the Dadaab camps and to move to Nairobi. And the reason she gives is this: the food ration given by UNHCR is not enough for the refugees. They only provide don't die survival. I have 1 minute left to try to make an argument that, well, that is probably not possible to make. But let me move to international law. There's a big difference between humanitarian principles, and humanitarian law is another thing, and international refugee law. When someone has their life endangered, they need a humanitarian intervention to preserve life at any cost. I mean, not at any cost, but you keep someone alive, you provide food, you provide water, you provide shelter, and you provide medical treatment. Once the emergency is over, the idea is that, you know, there should be protection, refugee protection in a broader sense. But when a person is in a camp for 17 years, yes, they're not being refouled, sent back to a country that's dangerous, but what other rights are being suspended over that 17-year period? And that is the question that I think Winona and I are trying to get at in our project. I would just like to make one quote from a UNHCR lawyer, staff person, who himself with Jane McAdam, his name is Jean-François Durieux, the two of them published in 2004 an important paper which suggests that human rights accrue over time in those spaces. It's not enough to provide food, water, and basic health. So he and Jane McAdam say, while some rights and restrictions may be justifiable during the initial emergency phase of a mass influx, protection should, in the spirit of the convention, improve over time rather than stagnate or deteriorate. So I'm going to leave it there. You can see that I'm a little bit, you know, feisty about this issue, but thank you for your attention and for coming out when there are few ways to get here. We all appreciate it.